Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alec Totten, and I am a student currently enrolled at the University of Maryland Global Campus working towards my degree in communication studies. Now, I think I speak for a lot of my fellow students out there when I say moving up in your desired field of study is not always easy. Sometimes you jump in only to hit a roadblock you weren't prepared for. Sometimes you simply lose interest. Sometimes you realize you're better suited to a different field entirely. Whatever it is, most of us have been through at least one of these. However, would you believe me if I told you that there's a practice in the education system that can discourage or even stifle a student's talents before they even enter college? For many of us, this took place before we even knew what we wanted to become, what we wanted to do with our talents. For many of us, this was a process that led to excess stress, to sleepless nights, a process that told us what we couldn't be rather than what we could. I am, of course, talking about test taking. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, and yes, test taking is obviously a staple of the education system. However, staples should be liable to change as we as a society move forward and work to accommodate different types of people with different experiences. So, I'm here today to elaborate on the flaws of test taking in pre-college environments, how it often fails to accurately represent students' knowledge, mastery, and skill level, how it excludes students with disadvantages, and how excessive time dedicated to test preparation can actually inhibit proper learning. Now, before we begin, it should be noted that not all tests are inherently bad ways of gauging a student's skills. Under the right circumstances, they can be considered solid ways of ensuring that a student at least has a baseline understanding of a given topic. However, one of the primary factors that complicates this, especially in the world of standardized assessments, are time limits. Now, time limits are problematic because they wrongly assume two things. One, they assume that all students are capable of working at the same pace. And two, they wrongly assume that pace and skill are directly correlated. The truth is, there are actually a wide variety of studies involving samples from different age groups to suggest that the speed at which a student works is not an accurate reflection of, and can in some cases even inhibit their performance. As stated by E.L. Mudge in the Journal of Educational Psychology in 1921, certain individuals who perform poorly under time limits do better when allowed to work at their own pace and vice versa, and that educational programs should do more to emphasize accuracy over speed, seeing as the former is often of greater value in everyday life. Additionally, timed assessments reward students who are capable of quick thinking and reading skills while punishing those with disadvantages in said areas. Consider for a moment, is it really fair to subject an entire student body to a set-in-stone time limit without accounting for individual backgrounds? What about students who learned English as a second language? What are they supposed to do? What about students with learning disabilities, for that matter? What about them? Now, the education system's answer to this, in accordance with Section 309 of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, is to allow disadvantaged students to elect for extended time on assessments. Usually, these students are given 50% more time, more or less, to work on their assessments than usual. However, multiple studies have shown that students with disabilities rarely end up using more than half of the additional time that they're given. As Morton and Gerensbacher wrote in their article, Diverse Brains for the National Institute of Health, when students request extended time or time and a half, what they're really requesting is not to feel the pressure of time ticking off, not to experience anxiety about running out of time, not to have an untimed power test administered as a time-limited test. Now, another factor to consider is that in order to allow for a different testing format, students with learning disabilities are often brought to entirely different testing locations from the rest of the student body. Now, as someone who has dealt with ADHD my whole life, I find myself reading about this and thinking back to my own time in high school and how the thought of not testing in the same environment as my friends, people who I looked up to at the time, made me feel singled out. It made me feel hurt, and while I've largely gotten over the sentiment and would encourage others to do the same, I will fully admit that at the time, it made me feel ashamed of myself and of my disability. Evidently, I'm not the only one who takes issue with this practice, as in their Seton Hall Law Review in 2019, constitutional law professor R. Kolker argued that the physical segregation of students with disabilities from their peers violates the intent of several U.S. disability laws, and that a more inclusive solution would be to make untimed power tests an option for any students seeking them. Another ideal for standardized tests is to view them not only as a means of identifying areas in which students can improve in, but areas in which instructors can as well. After all, shouldn't test scores be considered reflections of what students have been taught and what study material they've been given access to? Aren't instructors a large part of that? Unfortunately, overuse of high-stakes test-taking can actually have quite the opposite effect. In her article, When Testing Takes Over, written for the Harvard Graduate School of Education site Usable Knowledge in 2017, senior editor Barry Walsh writes that, in many places, high-stakes testing has led to severe score inflation. Gains in scores far larger than real improvements in learning, that is. In some cases, score gains have been 3 to 6 times as large as real gains in achievement. And these inflated scores don't provide an honest and useful indication of student performance. And the pressure to raise test scores has become so strong that testing often ends up degrading instruction rather than improving it. In other words, there's less pressure in schools to actually learn and retain material as much as there is to simply pass assessments with the highest score possible. Add to that the fact that test results are often given back to students long after they're still useful, and what you're left with is a system that promotes repetitive memorization over meaningful engagement, and fails to provide students or instructors with proper feedback. Instead, a testing format that could potentially benefit both parties would involve reducing the relation between assessments and overall class scores. For example, a teacher could give a short, relatively easy quiz on recent material that grants students immediate feedback and allows the teacher to identify areas generally considered challenging by the class. As writer and editor Carly Berwick describes in her article, What Does the Research Say About Testing?, written in 2019. Now, to reiterate, test taking is not an inherently bad practice. I don't want to give the impression that I believe that with absolute certainty. However, as stated before, it does have its place as a way to test baseline knowledge and to provide both students and instructors with feedback. However, in order to truly achieve this ideal, testing needs to be fair. It needs to account for differences in work pace, differences in advantage, and what does and doesn't qualify as an effective method of learning in addition to preparation. With all this in mind, I would encourage all of you to consider your own and others' experiences with test taking and ask yourself to consider what has to change in order to create a truly equal, truly supportive environment. Once again, this has been Alec Totten, and I thank you all for your time.